very engaging couple of speech.
I've just got the poll coming up in front of me. Okay, thank you, Thomas. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's really great to be with you all this evening. Thank you all for tuning in. Just a little bit about me then. Well, first of all, what I do. I sometimes do speak at conferences and things like that. I run one-day courses on succession, but my main business is actually facilitating the family to actually sit down and talk about succession. So a family gets in touch with me and says, well, okay, we're having a few difficulties, we need to talk it through. And so I arrange to have a meeting with them, sit them all around the table in the same room, usually in a neutral venue, so we can't be interrupted and all that sort of stuff, and everybody's on the same footing if we're in a neutral venue. And we go through the day, then everyone is allowed to express what they want to talk about and how they feel about things and all that and what they're concerned about. And then at the end of the day, hopefully we come up, well, we will, because I make sure, we come up with an action plan of what the family need to do. And there's got dates on it and who's going to do it. Because, we're all the same. We go to great meetings and we think, oh, that was great. And then we go home and don't do anything about it. So my, sort of mission is to make sure that there is an action plan there and people are held accountable for what they've decided they're going to do. So that's what I do. I've been doing it now for nearly 15 years. I was trained out in Australia. So a little bit of my background now. I was brought up in a dairy farm. I live in Pembrokeshire in West Wales, only about 20 minutes from the ferry over to you in Fishguard. And so, yeah, brought up on a dairy farm, married a dairy farmer. And then 15 years ago, I came out of farming, did an MBA, and then got into doing this facilitation. And that's been really helpful because having been in farming, I understand how difficult this conversation can be. And so, so that's one of the reasons also why I got into it. So I tell people, I'm the dairy farmer's daughter whose brother got the farm and I got nothing, which is fine because I'm of a generation where that was acceptable. But nowadays it's a bit more complicated, and this is why we need these conversations. And then, of course, I went and married a dairy farm and became the dreaded daughter-in-law as well. And so I understand how awkward that position can be too. So I've seen it from both sides, and as I say, I've been doing it for nearly 15 years now. So I've seen lots of things. Some things will probably make your hair stand on end. So what I say to people, first of all, is succession will happen. None of us get out of this alive. And so it's crazy to think that because succession will happen, the people don't embrace it and don't start talking about it. It's really important to start talking about it at an early stage, because the longer you leave it, the more difficult it gets and the less options you have as well as people get older as well. And, often if there are family conflicts or difficulties, they get worse as time goes on. They don't get better. And so you need to be addressing those issues at an early stage. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to start talking about a few things that maybe, as you as families can sit down and talk about yourselves, because hopefully you don't need somebody like me. And so, it's a good idea to be able to talk through things. So I'm going to talk a little bit, first of all, about the things you should really be thinking about and talking about when the young person comes back into the family business, okay? And so at this stage, this young person may have, been into university, travelled a little bit, maybe gone to Canada or New Zealand, Australia, whatever, and they've come back now onto the family farm. What are the things you need to be sitting down and talking about? Now, often people come back and they don't talk about anything, you just come back. But it's a good idea to sort of clarify things, clarify expectations, not just for that young person, but for the rest of the family as well. So everybody understands how this person is going to fit into the business and what their ambitions are. Okay, so it's always good when you have a conversation to start with the easy stuff. So, okay, this young person has come back onto the family farm now. The first easy thing to start talking about is time. What time do you expect this young person to start on the farm? What time are they expected to finish? Are they going to have weekends off or not? Every other weekend off? How many holidays are they going to have? Are there certain times of the year when they shouldn't have holidays because it's too busy, you're calving or lambing or whatever? And so it's an easy get into this difficult conversation. And it's very important. Hell, people fall out about this big time, you know. God, you should have got up at 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock this morning and didn't, you know. So clarifying that, and also, you know, holiday times as well. And when I go into families, often I'm the young person at this stage is coming back into the business. We talk about the young person's holidays, you know, how many holidays they're allowed to have a year and all that type of thing. But also mum and dad are sitting there thinking, well, he or she is home at the moment, we'll be able to have more holidays as well. And so it's having that conversation and talking around those things, because, you know, I have gone into businesses where, you know, people have booked skiing holidays just in the middle of carving and all that sort of stuff. So it prevents all that problem. So that's time, a nice easy one to start with. The next thing to think about then is, where is this young person going to live? Now, if they've been living independently for a while, and, you know, they've been traveling and and they may even have a partner or a spouse or someone coming back in with them, they're not going to move in back with mum and dad. Well, they shouldn't, if they can help it. And I would say, after doing nearly 15 years of this, it's a good idea if you don't live within sight of mum and dad. Okay, now we all have a bit of a laugh about this and say, oh yeah, you know, that's a good laugh and all that, but actually I've come across some really, really serious problems because families have lived too close together. And, you know, and it's been falling out with brothers and sisters and, you know, mum and dad, and it's been very, very difficult, really difficult. I mean, I'll tell you a little story. I did a family meeting in Ireland. Lovely, lovely family. I've got to know them quite well since. Smashing family. And when I got there, they were, the eldest son had come back with his wife, and the mum and dad were living in the farmhouse. There was an old stone building right next to the farmhouse, and they decided, mum and dad decided, they were going to renovate that building and move into that building, and the son and daughter-in-law would move into the farmhouse. So mum and dad chose everything for the barn conversion, you know, chose the bathroom and the kitchen and all that. When it came to it, dad wouldn't move out of the farmhouse. So daughter-in-law had to move into the barn conversion, where she hadn't chosen the kitchen and she hadn't chosen the bathroom, which was not great. And then she said to me at one point, she said, if my father-in-law wants my husband, he doesn't come and knock on the door. He walks round the house looking through all the windows to see if he can see him. Now, this is driving her up the wall. Now, these are the sort of things that happen. I've gone into families where they quarrelled about which part of the garden they're supposed to have, you know, where they park the car, all that sort of stuff. So, and people want privacy, particularly if they've lived independently for a while. And so it's really important that you don't live too close to each other. And if you do share the same farmyard, for goodness sake, you know, make sure there is some privacy. You've got a bit of fencing around there or something like that. Because as I say, I've come across huge, huge problems with this because people live too close together. So don't do it. Don't go there, folks. And, you know, some people say to me, oh, well, look, you know, it's going to be very expensive to go and buy a house down the village or something like that. A divorce is a lot more expensive. So for goodness sake, think about it, all right? So that's housing. And also when you're thinking about housing, you know, if you've got a couple of houses that are part of the farm business, make sure you sort out, you know, how the bills are paid, you know, because if one house has the electricity paid by the farm account and the other house doesn't, then that again is a sort of cause for concern and a cause for quarrels. So sort it out, sit down and sort it out. So that's housing. The next thing to think about then is money, the big one really. How are you going to pay this young person? They've come back now, maybe they've worked for other people and they come back to the family farm. And a lot of people say, oh God, you know, well, look, they're part of the family. We can't pay them the going rate. We'll have to pay them less. Well, that's fine. But you must acknowledge people for how much they're worth, because it's very important for their self-esteem. It's really important, you know, that they acknowledge that, okay, they are worth this. They would be paid this amount if they were working for somebody else. Now they're having to take a cut in wages to work here. And that's very important for siblings to understand as well, so that brothers and sisters do understand that brother or sister who's come back to the family farm are not being paid what they would normally get if they were working for somebody else. Okay, so that, you know, because that helps for people to understand. And so let's take an example in. So let's say, for instance, that a young person coming back into the business would normally be worth, say, 30,000 euro a year, normally. Okay, just plucking a figure out of the ether, really. And say you say, oh God, we can't pay them that, but we pay them 20. Okay, so that's fine. So you acknowledge they're worth 30,000 a year, you're paying them 20,000 a year, and now you say, right, okay, well, there is a 10,000 euro shortfall there. And you can think about this. Now, you have to talk to a tax advisor first. Now, whatever you do, this is a little bit thing, whatever you do, don't do anything without talking to somebody about tax first, no matter what you're talking about, because I've seen so many mistakes people have made because they've done some things in the wrong order or they've done the wrong thing. So for whatever you do, always check with your tax advisor. Very important. So anyway, say in this case now, as I say, there's a £10,000 shortfall. What you can look at is and say, right, okay, one of the things I would first say to look at is, look at the things you get as perks for working in the family business that you wouldn't get if you worked for somebody else. And those are things like, you know, the diesel tank on the yard, the use of a pickup, the mobile phone may be paid by the farm business, which wouldn't if you were working for somebody else. Those sorts of things. And put a value on them because they are of value. And also, again, it's for brothers and sisters to say, well, you know, that it's acknowledged, because I go into lots of families where the brothers and sisters, what I call the off-farm children, the young people who are not going to inherit the farm or not going to get the farm, you know, and they say, oh, well, it's all right for him. He's never had to pay for his pickup or whatever, you know. So put a value on it. So say in this example now it was 5,000 euro a year. So you've already gone from 20,000 euro up to 25,000 euro. So you've still got that 5,000 gap. Now I would suggest you may want to look at that. You may want to look, again, I said talk to a tax advisor, but that may be something, I would at the very least keep it as a record. Because what often happens to me is I get called into a situation where it's 20 years down the line, and brothers and sisters are saying, I want a share of something now. And there's this young person who's worked in that business for 20 years now, never been paid properly. And he or she is saying, well, hang on, this business owes me something because I've never been paid properly. And then we've got to work out how much it is. Well, if you keep a record of it, it's actually on a piece of paper. You know how much that is. So that's one thing you can do. The other way to think about it is that may be an opportunity, and that 5,000 euro to start buying their way into the business. So they may be able to say, right, okay, well, let's buy, then we will transfer £5,000, 5,000 euros worth of stock, livestock, to that young person. So that's their way of actually buying into the business. Again, talk to a tax advisor about this to make sure it's set up properly. But it is a way. So it's, you know, again, brothers and sisters aren't thinking, right, my brother or my sister's being handed this on a plate. You know, they are actually buying their way into the business. So those are some of the things that you need to sort of think about and talk about when you've got the young person and, you know, you're thinking about money. One of the things that, you know, I come to some families where they want to pay, obviously, or give something to the siblings who are not going to get the farm. And that's very important. Now, the first thing I say to parents is you don't have to be equitable to be fair. Just because a farm is worth so many million euro or whatever, doesn't mean to say that every child has to have exactly the same, because that's unrealistic for a start. It would never happen. But, you know, so, and sometimes I do find parents who work incredibly hard to try and say, oh, everybody's going to have equally the same. You know, what you want to aim for is that everybody has an equal opportunity in life. You know, they can go on and you're giving a good start to everybody. But to actually expect that everybody's going to have the value of the farm is totally unrealistic. So, you know, bring your kids up to understand that. But also, but you need to sit down and talk about what are those siblings going to get. And, you know, it may be property, it may be, you know, a site or whatever, but it's whatever can be afforded. But, you know, and you also take into account, you know, what they've already had. Has the farm already paid for their education? All that sort of stuff. So these are the sorts of conversations you need to be having with the family. And I always say, you know, to have what I call the off-farm children in that discussion, because they are part of the family. And I find that if they are not part of that discussion, they feel that something's been done behind their backs, and that's not fair. And that's when they start kicking up. So it's really important they're part of all these discussions about, you know, the farm and how the farm is going forward in the future. I do say, though, if there is to be a payment out to brothers and sisters, it's a good idea if you can do it at an early stage. Now, if you can't do it because you can't afford it, well, that's fair enough, you know, you can't do it. But if you can, it's a good idea, because then the young person going into the family farm doesn't have this thing hanging over them that one day they're going to have to pay out their brothers and sisters, and, you know, they don't know when it's going to happen, and it's this thing hanging over them. In fact, I've come into some families where the brother or the sister who's going to get the farm says, well, I'm not going to grow this business, because the bigger I grow it, the more I have to pay my brothers and sisters. Well, that's a disaster for a start, because if you're not growing your business, you're going backwards. So you need to think, you know, you need to talk about this, and is it a good idea maybe to pay brothers and sisters out at an early stage if you can? If you can. And I have come across families who have done that. And, you know, I do say to some, and when I talk to young farmers, I often say, you know, the ones who are going to farm, try and get rid of your brothers and sisters early, preferably not with a shotgun, but, you know, but try and get it out so that it's all sorted, so everybody understands what's happening. But if you can't do it, you can't do it. But at least make sure that everybody understands what they're going to get, so that it doesn't create problems in the future. Because sadly, what often happens is when the second parent dies, then all hell breaks loose with siblings. It can happen. So be very careful about it. So those are some of the things. The other thing, I do find in some families is they sort of say, right, okay, siblings are going to get a percentage of the sort of size of the business in the future. That can be a mistake, because once you've got the young person coming back into the business and they start growing that business, the growth of that business is often down to their efforts. And so it really shouldn't be shared with siblings. And so there should come a time where you draw a line in the sand and say, right, okay, from now on, the growth of this business is down to that young person's efforts and should not have to be shared with brothers and sisters. And that's quite important as well. Okay.
I think, Sian, that's actually an interesting question, because we've had a few questions in on the thing, and it might be a good time to maybe address one of those around not only, I suppose, identifying the point where growth is, you know, down to the young farmer, but let's say in a case where you have a father-son or a mother-daughter or any other variation therein, I suppose, how do you handle the distinction whereby maybe the farm is progressing and it's moving forward, driven by the young farmer, and that relationship can often be, because you're talking about management changes, you're talking about a very difficult thing, trying to change the ways of 40, 50 years, and maybe it's not even a good idea to change those ways. But how do you manage that conflict that can often come in partnerships?
Yeah, between parent and child.
Yeah, we'd say between established farmer, because some of them may be obviously aunts and uncles and non-related partners. But yeah.
I think it happens a lot. It happens a lot. And actually, psychologists tell us, as far as fathers and sons are concerned, there is such a thing as father-son rivalry. And I've seen it, you know, I've seen it from one end where fathers and sons get on extremely well, to the other end where I've gone in some of things where they wouldn't even sit in the same room together. It's a hell of a job to get them in the same room together because they quarrel so much. And so this is, again, where, you know, my next section, I'll be talking a little bit about communication. This is where communication comes in. And that's why it's important when the young person comes back to establish, right, okay, you know, when a role responsibility is going to be passed on to the next generation, when are mum and dad going to retire, what does retirement mean to them, all those sorts of things. But it's really communication. And you know, it's very important that the discussion is had with mum and dad and the young person, or aunt and uncle or whoever, you know, why do they want that person back? Are they just using them as a member of staff just because they can't cope anymore? Or do they want the business being driven forward so that the young person can make the choice? Because sadly, I go into a lot of businesses where the young person came back and was promised, yes, you'd be responsible for the business. And 20 years down the line, they're still being treated as if they're a staff member. And they always say to me, if I'd known it was going to be like this, I'd never come back. I'd rather have gone off and started on my own. And so it's much fairer to have that conversation right at the beginning and say, right, okay, what is your aim here? Are you going to allow me responsibilities? And, you know, how are those going to happen? And what are the time frames for those? You put time frames on it as well. And if the question there don't want to change, they need to say that. You know, don't encourage young people back and say, oh yeah, you'll be able to do this, and then not do it, because that's really unfair, really unfair. Yeah.
I suppose when you say about time frames, we have a question here, I suppose, about, and obviously this will vary hugely dependent on the farm, dependent on the different arrangements, and indeed on the health of and the age. But I suppose, is there, in your opinion and in your experience, is there kind of an optimized time? And what we might do, I suppose, while maybe we're discussing this, we might put up the second poll about where people are in that, so if people can take a time to do that. But I suppose, in your view, is there a realistic expectation or maybe an upper limit, or you know, for those sort of, when that process is triggered off, you know, when should you be expecting it to be completed?
As you say, this is why I do this job, because everybody's different, every business is different, and every family is different. And as you say, you know, you sometimes get people who've had their children quite young, and so they're still, say, in their 50s when the next generation comes in, and they're saying, hell, we don't want to retire yet. We're quite happy to carry on. And, you know, it's in New Zealand, for instance, I heard it once that they said the young person should have the checkbook by the time they're 30, you know, which is, you know, quite, you know, some people fall off their chairs for that. So it really depends on the individual. But I think it's so important to have that discussion at the beginning so that people understand what they're letting themselves in for. You know, are they there just to do what mum and dad or aunt and uncle have done for the last 30 years until they feel they can hand it on? Or are they open to more to advancing and to changing? And I think this is going to be increasingly important now, because I think farming is changing rapidly at the moment with the challenges of climate change and environmental issues and all that sort of stuff. Things are going to change rapidly, and so we do need young people to be able to make those decisions, you know, because a lot of the older generation, they're going to say, oh, 12 of that, I don't care about it. Well, you know, tough, we're going to have to face these things. And so it's really important, and I think we're doing a huge disservice to the industry if we're not giving these young people an opportunity to do things, you know. So maybe, and this is where Austin Finn and his thing comes in, maybe you come back to the family farm, and if it's not a very big family farm, you help out there, but you may take on another sort of block somewhere else where you're doing your own thing. You know, you may be able to do that if it's small enough. So there are those sort of, and I have come across, and he was Irish as well, this Irish lad some years ago, who was called home to the family farm, and he wasn't. He was promised that he was going to be allowed to do everything, and he wasn't when he got home. And he'd been managing 500 cows in the UK, and he came home to 70 cows. And, you know, and they said, no, we're not ready for it yet. And so what he did was he did take a block on nearby with somebody else, and so he was doing the two farms. So, you know, this is why this conversation is so important to be had, and people sort of think they're afraid to approach this, and it's important, because otherwise, you know, this is what creates the problems between generations then, you know, because they fall out. Okay.
Yeah. I think there's actually a kind of I suppose a question maybe related to that as well. We have, because this is something that we see as a perennial issue. I mean, the gender divide, even though we're in 2020, the assumption is always that it's going to be the son that's going to take on. And we have a question here about, I suppose, a female a farmer, or someone who wants to be a farmer. And I suppose, where do they really stand? Are they better off going, unfortunately, that route of looking for, you know, an outside parcel and giving up, or sorry, I don't mean giving up, but rather, you know, not continuing that conversation if it doesn't seem to be working at home. Like in those cases, I suppose, Sian, what would you advise?
Yeah, it's, you know, they're increasingly, I know some really good female farmers, really good now, excellent. And look, we are in 2020, and I would, you know, I often say to the older generation, for goodness sake, don't forget your daughters, because actually when I was in Australia, there was a survey, which I tried to find again when I left, but I didn't find it again. But there was a survey there that had been done by psychologists on farming daughters. And they were saying that the detrimental effects on farming daughters of not being considered for to be the successor was huge, absolutely huge. And there were people who were, these young women, driven to overachieve and all things like that, but they never felt satisfied because they were the girl and they were never allowed to be the farmer. So be very careful about that. You know, what are we doing to these girls? And so they, you know, so I do bang on about this to the older generation. And some areas of the people in the country, you know, in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, some areas are very good at this, and some are not. And so, you know, but it is changing. It's definitely changing now. There are a lot of young women out there, and they're really good at what they do. And also it's interesting, you know, that sometimes, and I've come across this in a couple of cases now, where the son was expected to take on the farm and the daughter wasn't, and she was the better one, and actually the son didn't want to farm, but it was almost that he was forced to because he was the boy, and there was the girl who wanted to farm. And so, you know, we had to have that conversation. So, you know, it's very important. And I do say to girls, you know, if the opportunity isn't at home, go and talk to Austin Finn. You know, there are going to be people who are not that biased, and it, you know, it's going to be much more acceptable as time goes on. And we need all these young people in this industry. We're doing a huge disservice if we're going to exclude 50% of the population just because they're girls. It's ridiculous, you know, ridiculous. Okay.
And I suppose that ties in with another question that we have here, kind of an element as well, because obviously we're talking about the 50% of people that are growing up on farms. But certainly our experience is some of the new entrants who come from nothing to do with farming, but are incredibly passionate around that. I suppose we have a question here about someone who has 3 children, not particularly interested in farming and continuing on the farm. I suppose, would you suggest to that person to maybe engage with the likes of Austin to try and bring someone maybe from outside their family in and try to build that? I know it won't be the same, and I'm sure there's, you know, that the idea of the family farm is that you hand over. But I think in a lot of these cases, we've seen a very, very good success rate when they're matched up well, which is what Austin does.
Yeah, well, I would definitely consider, because once that farm is gone, it's gone. You know, and you may think, well, right, okay, let's hang on, because maybe the grandchildren would want it. And so what do you do with it in the meantime? And the opportunity to give another young person who's come, you know, who's not got a family farm to inherit, giving them an opportunity for their working life to be able to progress is fantastic. It's a great thing to do. And I've spoken to quite a few of the farmers who have done this, and they say it's amazing. You know, they get a huge kick out of it because, and also what's good about it, instead of sort of renting the land out to summer grazing or whatever, you know, instead of doing that, what you're doing is you're keeping the farm at a standard, so that if the grandchildren did want to come into farming at a later date, the farm is in good heart. You know, it's still got the buildings, it's got the good heart, it's not been ruined, you know. And so, yeah, it's a fantastic thing to do. So, yeah, I would definitely, the first thing I would think of is giving another person an opportunity to be able to farm if the rest of the family don't want to. Yeah, important. Okay, shall I carry on? Have you got any more questions? Okay, yeah. So the other thing then, the main thing, if anybody sort of says to me, what is the biggest issue, the main issue, and you've probably got it by now, it's communication. It's actually talking about things. And it's really, really important that you get into the business of communicating as a multi-generational business, because it can be hard, because you've got the older generation, mum and dad, who've been used to making decisions themselves. They don't have to talk to anybody else about it. It may be just dad, you know, or mum, who didn't consider anybody else. They sort of think, oh yeah, I'm going to do such and such, and they go off and do it. All of a sudden, when you put the next generation in there, you need to be talking to them, because otherwise they're going to feel excluded. And also it's part of their training, you know, it's part of them being able to run that farm in the business, to be able to understand how decisions are being made, and they need to be part of those decisions. So one of the things I do in every single family meeting I'm in now is I talk to them about having proper business meetings. Now, people, when they first heard this, were like, what the hell are you talking about? You know, I see him at breakfast or whatever, you know. But you're running a business here. and you need to be taking time out from the day, you know, once a week, once a fortnight or whatever, just to sit down and talk through things. Now, it's important to say, you know, whether you want it once a fortnight, once a week or whatever, have a start time, but have an end time as well. So, okay, the meeting is only half an hour or whatever. So at least, you know, you think, oh, we haven't got time this week or whatever. And what I do with the family, I make sure that one family member is responsible for making sure those meetings happen. So if for 1 week, oh, we're TB testing or we're on the silage, we couldn't have the meeting, make sure there's somebody responsible for making sure you get back on track. And that meeting, you know, it can have minutes if you like, but, you know, the best thing, the things you would talk about is, right, okay, what happened in the last 2 weeks? What went well? What didn't go well? What did we learn? And what should we do differently next time? What are we doing in the next 2 weeks? So let's have a plan. And then also, you know, who's responsible for what? You know, so that, and I would then have that. You know, you can write it down if you want, but you could. The best thing to do is put it on a WhatsApp. You know, if you're on a WhatsApp group in the family, on WhatsApp. Then after the meeting, these are the things that were decided to be done in the next 2 weeks, and this is who's supposed to do it, so that everybody's clear. Because it's amazing. You can sit in a meeting and so says, "Well, you said you were going to do it," and say, "No, you said you were going to do it." So if you've got it written down and it's on your WhatsApp, you know what's happening. Again, it's clarity of communication is really important. And so, and it's all interesting when I see some of the families I've dealt with, they say that's the best thing that came out of it was actually making sure they're having the discipline of having those meetings. And some families go even further. They say, right, okay, every quarter or 3 times a year or whatever, we will have a strategic meeting, because those half an hour meetings are operational meetings, you know, they're day-to-day stuff. But there are other families then say, right, every few, perhaps twice a year, we sit down and have a strategic meeting. We look at the bigger picture, you know, what's happening. And some even have what's called like an AGM, where they sit and have a sort of annual review of what happened last year, what's happening next year. And they may include their accountant or their bank manager or their consultant as well. So they have a proper plan going forward. Excuse me. So that's, you know, what communication is really important. So it's not only the personal stuff, it's a business side as well. It has to be really well communicated, because that's where, again, the arguments start, because people are not communicating well with each other. Okay, so that's communication. Let me have a sip of water here. Right. I suppose the last area to look at when you're talking about the young person coming back into the business is this responsibility. What sort of responsibility are they going to have? And I you know, I talk to young people all the time, and they're dying to get a go at this. They really, you know, they can't wait to have a crack. And so it's very unfair if they're not given any responsibility at all. And if you can, excuse me, I think it's important to give them an area of business that they are entirely responsible for. If the older generation are still going to be there for a while and there's a transition period, then let's have the young person in charge of something. And so say if it's a dairy farm, for instance, well, they're in charge of rearing the young stock. So, okay, they get a calf, 24 hours old, being tagged and all that sort of stuff. Excuse me. And, right, okay, we want that animal calving back in the herd at 2 years old. Go away and do it. Now, okay, you've got to have checks and balances there. You've got to say, right, okay, this is your budget, so you don't spend too much money. And we'll weigh this animal every sort of few months to make sure that she's on track. But giving them sole responsibility for that is important, because then they feel they're part of the business. And, you know, they'll go off and they'll research how well to, you know, to rear young stock. So it's those sort of things that's really important for young people, that they get the responsibility. And ideally, what you ought to be looking at when you're talking to mum and dad about this, at some stage you must be saying, right, okay, when are mum and dad going to stand down? And I talk a little bit in a minute about sort of retirement and all that sort of stuff, but when are they going to be stepping back? And, you know, it's like a sort of a graph really, where mum and dad's responsibility is up here, young person down here when they start off. Over time, mum and dad's responsibility should go lower and the young person's should increase. And somewhere along the line, they cross over. And that should really have a date on it. And so that is the date when the overall responsibility for the business passes from one generation to the next. Now you can sit and plan this, and it's to, you know, it's all to do with abilities of the people and the ages of people involved. But it's a good idea to do that because people have something to aim for then. You know, they know when it's going to happen. And so that, you know, that's the area of responsibility that I think needs to be talked about. So that's really the young person issue. I've only got about 5 minutes left. By the way, you probably gathered by now I could talk for months about this. But the other things that you need to talk about, probably at a later stage, or even, you know, perhaps not, is, you know, one of the questions I ask the older generation is, what does retirement mean to you? Because retirement to farmers means totally different things. I mean, I've gone into some farms where dad can't wait to get out the gate, and the other one where they're saying, the only way you're getting me out of here is in a box, and all points in between. So you need to understand what retirement means to that older generation. Do they still want to be part of that business? And, you know, if so, when are they going to decrease their activity in the farm? So, you know, well, I say to the old generation, okay, right, you're 65 now. What are you going to be doing when you're 70? You know, what are the responsibilities you want then? What about when you're 75? What are you going to be doing then? You know, and well, I don't want to be milking now or whatever. So you've got a plan of how they step back from the business. And it's better for them, but also, you know, it's good for the young person, again, to understand what's happening. But, you know, mum and dad may often, in fact, parents say to me, well, I don't want to be there every day, or I don't want to have to be there, but I want to come and help, and I want to still be part and know what's going on. And so understanding that is really important, and making sure that the younger generation value that older generation. Because let's face it, if it wasn't for their blood, sweat and tears, there would be no succession, because there would be no farm. And so we have to value and respect what they have done, at the same time as wanting to bring the young people in. And so you need to have that discussion about what mum and dad are going to do. Where are they going to live? Have they got enough pension to live on? You know, all those sorts of things have to be considered. And so I say to young farmers, and I'll say to all of you out there, for God's sake, don't lose your hobbies. Because the number of farmers I've come across who say, well, you know, I don't want to be doing things particularly on the farm much more, just the odd thing, but I got nothing else to do. Well, you know, and then the mother is saying, well, you're going to be under my bloody feet all the time anyway. So, you know, it's very important that we understand what dad, particularly dad, sometimes mum usually says, oh, I've got a long list of things I want to do. But it's dad is there, well, I haven't got any other interests. So it's really important that we talk to dad then about, right, okay, what are you going to do? And so help him through that as well. So young farmers, don't lose your hobbies. Make sure you're still, you know, interested in GAA or whatever, rugby or whatever you want to do. So I've only got a few minutes left now. Are there any more questions? Because as I say, I can go on forever.
Yeah, I suppose there's a very pertinent one, because it's one we come across an awful lot. We're talking the entire time about, you know, starting that conversation. There's one person on the questions who's saying, what happens if only one person is interested in having that conversation? I'm assuming since they're on here, it's them. And they're being left in a state of limbo. There's no real, I suppose, is it a take it or leave it, you know, an ultimatum advisable? Are you better off to, I don't know, to suggest that you may be leaving the farm if there's no succession? A very difficult conversation to have, especially in a family farm situation. But I suppose in those ones, are there any steps that someone could do to maybe not get to that ultimatum point? Yeah. Is there any way to step them to that conversation first? Yeah,
that is the end thing if you actually fail. But so I would suggest, you know, you've got to be sensible about this, and you've got to try and understand. I mean, I do a whole day's course on communication and people skills, and that's where this comes in, you know, understanding the people you're talking to and what they want out of life and all that. So, you know, there's a whole course on this, but, you know, it's understanding what they want out of life and showing some respect for, you know, showing a lot of respect to them and understanding what they want. And maybe, you know, it's sort of chipping away at it sometimes, you know, just suggesting little things as time goes on. The other thing you can do is, and often this has worked with quite a few people, is think of people who, the parents, your parents, if it's your parents or aunt and uncle or whatever, think of people that they respect, and go and talk to them and ask them if they will help on your behalf to get them to start talking. Because if there's somebody that they respect and, you know, they hear it from them, and even that person may even help with that discussion, that's a good way of doing it. So there are things you can do. And as I say, you've got to understand where they're coming from. And, you know, often it's fear. you know, it's fear that they don't want to talk about this because they're frightened of things. And so in trying to understand that, and if it's only one parent who's being awkward, you know, try and get the other one on your side, that type of thing, or the rest of the family as well. So it's talking to other people first and trying to understand why there's this blockage there. But yes, you're right, Thomas, if it comes to it and they completely refuse, then you have to make a decision. And it's a bloody hard decision, but it is. You either put up and shut up and stick it out, or you go. And that's what you have to do. And as I've said, you know, I said earlier, a lot of people I've spoken to have been there 20, 30 years and said, I wish I'd gone because I then could make my own way, you know.
Yeah, I think we hear an awful lot of that. And I think that the comment you were making around living off farm is one that I got from one of our young farmers of the year. And he said it was vital to live off farm because otherwise you just get into the rut. And I think there's nothing more toxic to that communication then, you know, there being no family time, farm time, you know, you're discussing it over Sunday dinner, it never stops. And certainly a lot of siblings get burnt out from listening to it as well and may not want to come around for Christmas dinner if we're allowed with COVID. But I think at that, Sian, I think we really do appreciate it. Like, we have other questions, but we might be able to get back to them at the end. So I think we might just hand over to Austin Finn. Thank you so much. I'm sure like the place is big enough. I'm sure there'll be plenty to come back to at the end of it. So I'm going to welcome on Austin Finn, the Macra Land Mobility Service Manager and lead facilitator. I suppose, Austin, I think you have a prepared presentation, I think, for us, I suppose, about just some of the key areas that Macra the Land Mobility Service is really delivering on. And I know we have some questions, actually, that probably would be relevant to you too, so they might be answered in this. Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. And thanks, Sian. That's a very interesting discussion and conversation. Can people see my PowerPoint?
It's coming up for me anyway. If anyone can't see it, they can just drop it in the chat to us and we should be able to see it.
Perfect. Okay. Just how to go on to the next page. View options. I can't get, I'm just having difficulty getting it to move on to the next screen. That's all. Okay.
We might let our technical wizards behind the scenes, Bridget, or no, we're working.
Are you doing it, Bridget, or?
No, at the moment, I think, Austin, you're sharing, or Bridget, are you? You can drop us, either of us, a chat there. Yeah, there we go. Perfect.
Just there again. That's perfect. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Sorry about the delay there. So just I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to everyone, and Program Manager of the Land Mobility Service. And just the outcome of this, I would hope you'd all have an understanding why we have such a service, what we do, what are being the benefits, and something about the land mobility options. And Sian referred to some of the things like where there isn't an obvious plan or a solution within the family, we can be very useful to help find alternatives or help people. That's what we're here to do. So the background to the service, and these stats haven't changed, is the age profile and the number of full-time farmers that have no identified farming successor, you know. And that's the core. What the service does, like, we've sort of three key elements. The first part is all about information and awareness, explaining to people what the options are and how other things might work. And a lot of this stuff is relatively new templates, new thinking. Some things borrowed from New Zealand, a lot of taggish research, some things borrowed from other countries, but in practice they're working, and everything has to be adapted to Ireland. And Ireland is actually unique, like there's no two farms the same in Ireland. So even within a sort of a template, it's different for every farm. After that, then we're about delivery of arrangements. And the key here is that the arrangements have to be appropriate to the farm and to the people involved. They have to be fair and they have to be sustainable. Like the doomsday scenario for anything is 1 or 2 years into that it falls apart, either because of lack of finance or the thing just doesn't work. So where people have identified someone they want to work with, we will help facilitate something. Where they don't know of anyone, we will help match. We do matching service. So we help find people. So we find potential farmers for landowners, and for potential farmers or existing farmers looking to expand, we help find landowners. And then once an arrangement is in place, we're there to support that arrangement. So that's can be annual reviews. Some of the arrangements can be more complicated, so there could be a lot of support, particularly in the first year. And because of the support we have ourselves from the likes of FBP Trust, Macra, Department of Agriculture, dairy processors like Glanbia, Dairy Gold, Arrivo, Lakeland, Kerry, we're able to offer, it's a subsidised service, you know, which I think is very important, so people are not put off that this is going to cost them much. It is a subsidised service, and that's to encourage use. So just a breakdown of the type of people we're dealing with at any time. So approximately 45% of the people at any time we're talking to are landowners looking to step back. And then on the other side, it's nearly equal between new entrants or new operators and existing operators looking to expand. So the two sides of the court, so you have the landowner on one side and the collaborator on the other side. So the main group of landowners we work with and deal with, and this is a massive cohort within the landowner grouping, are those that either don't have a farming successor, so they have successors within the family, but none of the successors are going to go full-time farming. They have their own careers or they have made other choices, so there isn't an obvious farming successor. Or there is a farming successor, but there's viability issues. So there isn't enough scale for two families or two people to get an income out of it, or for whatever reason. And these are the groups we tend to help. So where there's no farming successor, we might find someone. Where there is a farming successor and they need to enlarge or to find an alternative farm to run in conjunction with, we're there to help that. So that's the landowner side. On the collaborator side, then the groups are, so you have the young trained farmers who have maybe coming from small farms, or there's not enough space at home, there's not enough scale for two incomes, or they have infrastructure constraints, so they're looking for options. The others will be farm managers who probably have no land and are looking to make the next step rather than to just be employees that want to be farmers in their own right. And then the final group are established farmers looking to expand. So some of these might be looking to take on second unit in conjunction with family members, or just looking to expand on their core base. So again, then you start thinking about what type of arrangement can we look at? What are the options out there? We find you have to be open. You're better off, the more open-minded you are to all these things, the more options will arise and things. And it's more about the suitability and sustainability than the arrangement type. All the arrangement types are just different legal forms that have all different pros and cons. And I'll go through some of them and explain it. But in the end of the day, you're dealing with contract law with them all. They're all legal agreements and it's contract law. So there's no template, neither partnership nor a share farming or a lease. None of them have a legal precedence over the others. So what's most important is that they've been properly facilitated, good independent advice, so people have checked with their accountants and their solicitors and friends or whatever, and to go through a proper process to make sure everyone is fully aware of what they're getting involved into and how it's going to work. So then what are the options? So these are, in summary, on just one page, these are the type of options that work in Ireland and are operating in practice in Ireland. So you have long-term leases, you have partnerships, you have share farming, and there's a certain amount of overlap between partnerships and share farming. You have farm to farm, which what would fall under that would be things like contract rearing, silage, and then post-silage grazing arrangements, these type of things. And then the final mobility one is obviously farm transfer, which dealt with separately. So in terms of the mix, in terms of the no change in ownerships, what we facilitate, like on average each year, like this year, we will probably end up facilitating arrangements in 120 or 130 farms. And the breakdown of that, about 41% of them will be some form of long lease. But all the others then are some form of something else. So it's either partnerships, a share farm, farm to farm. So there's far more things happening, believe it, in the partnerships and share arrangement than a lot of people realise. Because there tends to be more, so maybe media focus and overall focus, or even awareness as regard leasing, but but you need to have the options. But there is far more going on outside leasing than people often realise. So just to explain then, from a legal and a farming perspective, the different options and arrangements. So with long-term leasing, the farm operator is the farmer. The positives with long-term leasing, they tend to be clean and simple arrangements, where it's arrangements outside the family to non-connected people. It's extremely tax efficient. You can get a sizable amount of income tax-free, and it delivers access to land. Where leases run into problems and their constraints is if the rent is too high or the lease is too short, if someone has to invest in a farm and the lease is too short. New entrants are often disadvantaged when it comes to leasing compared to established operators. Established operators tend to be better positioned to take on leases because they will have stock, or they might have more equity or more finance available to them. And from the landowner's point of view, I suppose the downside of the long-term lease is that he's forced into full retirement. Like, he's no longer the farmer, which can have potential BPS issues. It can have potential other issues, you know, for individuals. So for many people, for many landowners, it's often a trade-off. Do I go for the tax-free money, or do I go for something that I'm still involved? Partnerships then. So when most of us talk in the Irish context, when we talk about partnerships, we tend to think of the registered partnership. So that's a partnership that's registered with the Department of Agriculture. So there can be other partnerships. They're still partnerships. They're registered with revenue. Everything has to be registered with revenue, but they're not registered with the Department of Agriculture. So the one that's registered with the Department of Agriculture, it's one entity, and the partnership is the farmer. I'll just lead on to, within the family, they're actually an excellent mechanism. And from experience now, I think it's a great mechanism for young people to get involved in the family farm. It allows the parents to step back slowly, allows the younger people to get involved. There's no need to actually change ownership of assets or anything. It has tax and single farm payment benefits. The whole farm can benefit from the young farmer schemes. It doesn't often work as well outside the family, because with a registered partnership, you have to bring all your farm and businesses into the partnership. So you can't sort of have a partnership for part of your farm and be farming the rest of it yourself. So within the family, it works because you're bringing everything together anyway. But outside the family, it doesn't always work. But within a family, the registered partnership is actually an excellent mechanism, and it does facilitate and safeguard succession planning, you know, because it gives both sides, say, well, how is this going to work? Is there enough scale here? Do we really want to farm, and things like that? And again, communications is so important, as Sian referred to. So outside the partnerships or the registered partnership, you're into the sort of the shared farming arrangements, the FARA. These have many names and guises. Like, so it can be anything from a dairy partnership, contract production, shared milking. All these are different forms of shared arrangement. So each party in these is a farmer. So for a young person getting going, it provides a great opportunity to get access to land at much lower equity. You're spreading the risk. For the older person, it allows them to step back and still be, at least on paper or dealing with the department or EU authorities, still a farmer. They're very flexible and dynamic, and they do evolve over time. And ones we have set up, they're continuously changing, and the mechanisms are there to allow that to happen. So someone can come into a place and they will buy into, say, some of the farm, into some of the herd. And then as things grow, as the owners want to step back more, they can buy into more of the herd. And maybe after 3 or 4 years, they will own the whole herd. And then maybe 3 or 4 years after that, a discussion might be had, right, now I'm in a position to take it on as a lease, or we could change it to a lease, or we can continue as it is. You know, so it's very dynamic and flexible in that. So from a landowner's point of view, they can step back and remain active farmers. So that gives them flexibility, even though they won't be getting the tax relief or the income tax relief from it as leasing. They can exit their farming in a very structured and a tax efficient manner. They can manage the sale of their stock, and they can avail make the best use of their income average and not exit, not have a sort of a sudden hit. And their farm and themselves benefit from the skilled young farmer coming in. For the young farmer side of you, there's less equity and finance required, like, because you're gradually buying in. Like, for any young person, say, taking on a significant farm, if you were to take on a 150-acre farm on a lease, like, the amount of finance required to operate that and to stock it can be phenomenal, and it can really make it very difficult for the young person. For the young person in this, the risks and rewards are shared. So on a bad milk price year or a bad grain price year, at least the risk is spread. You know, you're not carrying all the risk, where if you're in a lease situation, you have to pay the rent whether the thing is good or bad. And as I said, the arrangements can evolve over time. And the last group are the farm to farm, and say under this, like contract rearing, contract production, silage and short term. Yeah. So these are great mechanisms for people to maybe gradually step back. Will do, instead of being very active farmer, they'll go into a sort of a contract production, contract rearing. There's less risk, probably less work involved for the landowner. For an expanding operator, it allows them to get access or use of some ground, you know, on a less tie down basis, you know, but still get the use. The most important things with these farm to farm, I find, is that for the purpose of clarity, that everyone is clear, one, and for cross compliance and things like nitrates, it's important that you have some sort of agreement in place. They don't have to be complicated agreements, just simple agreements, because if you get that cross compliance inspection or you have a nitrates query, once you have the agreement, that'll tick the box and just answers all the questions and gets away, you know, make sure everything is sorted out. Otherwise, people are getting the use of ground, but they're not getting the nitrates benefits and things like that. And so they can be entering into arrangements and paying someone that works out very counterproductive for them. But if they have a proper agreement in place, can deal with a lot of that stuff. So finally, and I just briefly, because I know the lads are, Declan will cover the tax, the farm transfer, the thing, and I just said that's probably the other bit. And the things to consider here, I suppose, are tax, income security, farm viability, and the fair deal. But the point I'm more making here is that land use options and succession planning are not necessarily the one or at the same time. And most of these arrangements, so I think as landowners and as young people looking at these things, we have to think of the farm plan first. What's the plan for the farm? You know, what's going to be the farming plan, and the succession is nearly a separate plan. So take for example, if there's no farming successor, what's the best for the farm? Is it best that we keep it going and let it run down and try to dabble, and I'm trying to work here and I have, as an owner, having a terrible life because I'm not able to run the farm properly and the farm has been gradually run down? Or am I better off entering into an arrangement with someone else or leasing out the farm? By doing that, you're not affecting your succession plan. Like, just because you have a farm leased out doesn't stop you from passing it on to the next generation. All the next generation have to do is to honour what's left in the lease, and that for that next generation will tick a lot of boxes in terms of tax relief, because they have to avail of the agricultural relief for inheritance tax. They have to either farm themselves for 6 years or have it leased to an active farmer for 6 years. So a lot of these land use options, be them leasing, share farm, partnerships, support succession planning, but they don't all have to be done at the one time. So just to think of the farm plan on one side, what's the best for the farm, and then separately look at the succession planning side by side. And usually having a working and better developed farm, and a farm that's going to enhance over time, will be better for everyone. And a sign referred, like, if you are even thinking it could be the generation after next that might end up being the farm and successors, but I think it's good for the farm to be farmed in the meantime. So that's sort of just an overview of what we do as a service. As I said, it's subsidized service, very confidential, and we're here to support people. So thank you for that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Austin. And I think we had a few questions come through there. We'll address them at the end. I'm going to hand you over now to Declan McEvoy of IFAC Accounting, and we'll let Declan take over there and run us through, I suppose, some of the matters.
Okay, thanks very much, Thomas. What I'm going to look at is just a quick high-level overview of tax and some of the other issues that have come up. Austin referred to some of them, so I'll overlap on a few, but I won't go into detail. I won't overlap duplicated. So we're looking at the one thing that everyone has to look at is that no matter where we look, taxes have to be considered in the equation. And when we look at it, when we're looking at a transfer here, we have to look at capital gains tax, VAT, income tax, look around the structure. We have to look at capital acquisitions tax. Lifetime transfer is a gift, transfer by will is an inheritance, and stamp duty. So they have to be taken into account in our overall look at it. So where do the taxes land? Before I look at where the taxes land, we're lucky in this country that we've a suite of tax reliefs that in most cases deal with the tax issues and minimize or negate the tax issues. And where they can't be minimized or negated, it's because of people not taking advice, not drawing up a proper will, not implementing advice, or going on very, very bad advice. If you take the advice that's available and the proper advice that's out there, the tax issues can be negated in most cases. So if we look at on the transferor, capital gains sits with him, income tax issues because he may be ceasing to farm, he may be reducing his farm operation, and if they're in a registered succession partnership, part of the credit will go to him. We then look at the transferee. He or she is liable for the gift or inheritance tax on what he or she is getting. They're liable for stamp duty if they don't meet the reliefs, and stamp duty on a lifetime transfer only. They need to seriously look at a structure to minimize their tax, because in most cases, the structure is changing from parents married, maybe no off-farm income, back to a single person taking over the tax, or even the next generation taking over maybe an off-farm job, their spouse working, need to look at that. And also then, if they're in a registered succession partnership, need to look at the succession credit, what effect that will have on them. So we then look at what the forgotten issues are. And the forgotten issues sit with the transferor first of all. There can be a site to other family members, the farmhouse, and what happens same. Remember, if the farmhouse is separated from the land and transferred at a different time to the rest of the land, it may not qualify for agricultural relief and could cause issues. Also, if the parents transfer the land and retain an exclusive right of residence in the farmhouse, it doesn't become an agricultural asset, it passes separately. So careful issue has to be looked at on that. Other family members have to be taken care of. Protecting oneself, the transferor. Most transferors have this wish to protect the asset, and particularly protect the asset in the event of a breakdown of relationships and that. But one thing that should be looked at from both sides is the viability. Is the farm viable to meet what the transferor and the transferee are looking for, and also to look after other family members if they have to be settled out of it? And the one thing that's often forgotten about is, even if you don't do anything, make sure you update or make a will to ensure that the farm goes to wherever you would like it to go. If you look at a big deal that comes up for the transferor and also for the transferee, is the Fair Deal Health and Nursing Home Support Scheme. A potential charge on the land that, unless properly planned for and properly structured, can be a massive, massive burden on the successor. And that's something that needs to be factored into it, and is one of the reasons that people at a younger age are beginning to seriously look at moving on the asset so they won't have the burden of the Fair Deal scheme. So where there is an identified successor in place, that's the easy one. Austin went through a number of the issues that are there. But when we look at the cases there where there's an identified successor, and at that stage, tax is on the agenda and you can look at it. So for the identified successor, they're trying to maximize their tax reliefs, ensure to meet all the qualifications for the relief, know what the reliefs are, examine the viability that they're able to pay off other family members, look after parents, maybe take over debts, you know, settle any costs that are there. And they need to be aware what is the cost of all this, and is the farm viable with taking on debts. I've dealt with a number of cases where very, very viable farms become unviable because of the cost of trying to settle with other family members, and the burden and expectation of the farm to pay out is way in excess of what the farm needs. And Sian was talking about communication. This is where communication becomes vitally, vitally important. So the potential successor then, they have to ensure they don't accidentally disqualify themselves for relief. And that also happens with the transferor. If they don't know who a potential successor is, they need to be taking advice to make sure that they don't accidentally disqualify someone from the reliefs. The reliefs we're talking about there is agricultural relief, business relief, stamp duty. The structure needs to be identified. You know, let it be a potential successor, even if a successor is not identified. And where there is a potential successor, they need, even before getting the land, ensure to have a will drawn up, but particularly if they suddenly have a land transferred to them, that they get their will drawn up and ensure that they identify what they would like happen at that stage. If they're married, it goes to their spouse. If they've young children, children can't be identified at that stage who will be a farmer. So they might have to look at structures like a trust in a will to look after something like that. Stamp duty. Stamp duty was the silent tax for a number of years. It has now become the elephant in the room. And the reason it has become the elephant in the room is there's a look back now to 2014 in relation to stamp duty relief. The maximum relief a young trained farmer can get in stamp duty is, in all reliefs, is 70,000, which includes stamp duty, 100% stock relief, plus the succession tax credit. Now that 70,000 ceiling was set under the old cap, so maybe under the new cap there will be a proposal there to lift it. I know it's been talked about at 100,000, which will be a positive move. And where the trap comes in, if land was bought in the young farmer's name, and that young farmer saved 7.5% stamp duty on it, so say take $1 million worth of land, 7.5% saving on that is that's a farmer saves 70,000 in stamp duty. Suddenly the home farm becomes liable to stamp duty, notwithstanding the fact that they are under 35, and that because they've already used up the 70,000 ceiling. So it's a looking back mechanism. For the previous number of years, you need to be aware of what has been claimed. Looking at capital acquisitions tax, it sits with the transferee. They need to be able to claim either agricultural relief or business relief, which reduces the value of the asset from its full value down to 10%. And it's a double hit. You have to meet an asset test, 80% of what you own on the day you get it, plus you must be an active farmer or lease it to an active farmer. And if you're leaving it to a nephew or niece, a favoured nephew or niece relief can apply, has to be planned for, because that person has to be helping you on the farm for a number of years. But that, under this relief, you can actually transfer 3.3 million of agricultural assets and not have a liability to capital acquisitions tax. Every single tax, stamp duty, capital gains and capital acquisitions tax, have their own rules, and there's specific standalone taxes that have to be looked at. And on a lifetime transfer, the 3 taxes apply, but on death or by transfer by will, it's only capital acquisitions tax, inheritance tax. So with proper tax planning, with vision, with a mission, with an action, with a strategy, the goals can be reached of actually bringing the tax down to negligible levels. If we look at the thresholds, Class A, which is parent to child or parent to favoured niece or nephew, 335,000, which is 3.35 million. Class B is to a blood relative, is 32,500, and Class C is a non-relative stranger, 16,250. So quite significant thresholds when you look at it, that they're only 10% of the value of property that can transfer. It often comes up that there's maybe a piece of land after being sold, or you're after inheriting cash or that type of thing. Cash can be gifted on condition to buy land and it gets agricultural relief. Now, there is a certain amount of abuse of that at the moment, and it's something that I'd say is being carefully monitored by Department of Finance. But someone getting, if a parent is lucky enough that they're wealthy enough that they have a large amount of cash in the home farm, they can gift the cash to buy land and get big tax relief on it. Other assets have to be looked at for the transferee, the successor, that they don't disqualify themselves from agri relief. The one thing that must be taken into account, if you do disqualify from yourself from agri relief and you're taking over the farm business, you can actually get business relief on the assets as well. So again, with proper advice, proper structuring, relief is available. And the last thing, and the important thing, is tax should not be a driver of the succession plan. The succession plan should plan without tax first of all, and then tax comes in as a consideration at that stage. The plan may be tweaked for tax, but under no circumstances should the plan be purely tax driven. It should be driven by the needs of the transferee, the transferee, and the family. So that's my overview, and I'll hand you back now to Thomas now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Declan. I think we can go back, I suppose, of all the absolutely wonderful, and it's a very complicated area, I know. So if some people do have some questions around we had some questions actually earlier on that we might kick off. Sian, if you want to, yeah, so everyone is back on the call. So we might go through just a few of the questions, I suppose, that we've touched on. I'm going to leave these as open questions if any commentator wants to answer on them. So I suppose we have one here. I'm in my early 20s and my dad is in his late 40s, so fairly close age gap there. Are starting a new enterprise, mainly down to myself. Should I start the discussion around partnership? I think maybe one for Austin or Sian there.
Yeah, well, just to say for me, I mean, you know, as you need to be starting to talk about it, because if that business hadn't been done unless you were a part of it, then, you know, you should be considering. I wouldn't comment on the structure, but you should be considering that, you know, your name is on part of it, you know, because it's what you're doing. So
perfect. Okay. I think it was a question during Austin's presentation. How does a young person demonstrate their commitment to farm? I think it was maybe a little bit touched on as well in Declan's, but just maybe a quick run through, because I know this can be an area where a lot of people can fall down on.
What do you think he means by commitment to? Like, there's different.
I think it's under the Young Farmers Scheme. There's often, I'm assuming this commentator, and if they actually mean it more for Sian, for proving to their parents or to any other, you can send another question into us and we'll clarify. But I'll take it, Austin, as for the Young Farmers Schemes, etc. Yeah,
because there are, like for certain of the schemes, there's obligations. Like if you're go into farming, and if avail of, say, go to the National Reserve for entitlements, or availing of the Young Farmer Scheme, either on your own right or through a family partnership or through another partnership, as part of cost compliance, you do have to be able to show or prove that you're farming. So, like, say, take an example, if someone is working and living in Dublin and they try to form a partnership with their parents down in Kerry and are only down once a week or once a fortnight, they are not a valid farmer from the point of view of those schemes. And actually the department have a little booklet of questions, and most people, if you're involved in the farm, you'll have no problem. Like, it's just things like how many livestock you have, what type of breeding policy you have, who are your local contractors. So, anyone who's involved in the farm will know these things, but if you're not involved in farm, and the reason why the department brought out these things is that, like with any scheme, people have tried, like there's people who are maybe based in Australia, tried to fall into partnership at home, tried to avail of scheme, and in fact, that type of thing only discredits the schemes, you know, so it is important. The schemes are there for people who are genuinely going to farm, and they're there to help those. And same with tax reliefs.
Yeah, as someone that's gone through the inspection process, I can tell you, if you weren't actively farmed, it's fairly hard to demonstrate it. Some of the again, from my own experience, some of the requests that they'll make is obviously you have to have your bank number, or you have to have a bank account in all names registered. They'll also check with merchants to see that the merchants have been updated with either the farm partnership number or recognising the new young farmer. I think there's another element as well that we actually ran afoul of, because we very rarely ever sell animals, and I think we sold them to one factory which only had my dad's name on list, and we were kind of told get that sorted quickly, and we said, well, we don't sell that often to them, and they said doesn't matter. So it's a very intensive process, and people can run afoul of it. I suppose maybe from either a taxation or from a partnership point of view, or maybe Sian from a relationship point of view, we have an interesting example here. 2 sons working off farm, earning 40k plus. The father is 61 years old, full-time dairy farmer. What is the best structure, company or partnership? I'm going to assume that both sons want to become involved in the farm by the sounds of that thing. So they're asking about company, a partnership. Maybe Austin, maybe Sian can comment from I suppose, managing the relationship point of view then as well. And then we might move on to 1 or 2 of the taxation, because we've a good few of them for Declan as well.
I suppose, just as Sian said, the first thing they need to do is have the 3-way conversation themselves, and then need to start talking to their advisors, the likes of Declan, ourselves, and go through what are the options. I've often found that in that scenario, possibly entering into a partnership first and if you can avail of things like stock relief and things like that, and that depends on whether the farm is growing or not. And then if tax becomes a problem when you've run out of the other roads, maybe then look at incorporation. But you need to talk among themselves first, then talk to other people and come up with a plan. And every farm is different, so you can't give exact answers for this sort of thing in this type of forum. Sian, anyone else can take it on? Yeah.
From the personal point of view, then, I think, as Austin said, it's very important to sit down and talk about this, because you need to be thinking about, are you all heading in the same direction? Because what I've come across with some families is, they've gone into partnerships with siblings or whatever, and one of them was very ambitious and the other one wasn't. And so I get called in 10, 20 years time, and they're saying, well, one is saying to me, well, my brother held me back, and all this sort of stuff. So you've got to make sure that if you're going to be part of a partnership or a business structure, that you're all heading in the same direction. That's really important, because otherwise it creates huge family problems.
Okay, brilliant. I have them coming in thick and fast, so if I don't get to everyone's, I apologise. I suppose, Declan, probably from a taxation point of view, I have a question here. Can you be a favourite nephew/niece more than once? If a pair of uncles are already in partnership, how can they be transferred to a nephew in the most tax-efficient way?
The answer is yes, because it's a condition that you must spend more than 15 hours a week, helping. So if the uncles are in partnership and farming, and you are helping out in that partnership for more than 15 hours a week, you'll meet the conditions on both sides. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. There's a number of very technical kind of very detailed questions. So what we might do is we might feed some of those on to the, for anyone that's used an anonymous attendee would maybe want to submit, I'm just trying to think, we'll arrange probably a way to submit them maybe directly. Follow-ups and questions received after. Okay, perfect. And what we might do, so we're skillsnet@macra.ie is the best place for people to send an email, and we'll forward those on as best we can. There's an interesting one here. There are 2 houses on the same farm parcel. Can relief be claimed on both houses if the parcel will be split and the house will be going to each of the 2 siblings? I'm assuming the 2 siblings are availing of taxation relief. as young farmers? Declan, do we know?
In simple terms, yes, but it gets down to what plot of land is going with each house, how big is the land, and it comes back to the one thing, the elephant test. Is the house a farmhouse? When you look at it, is it a farmhouse? Because I've come up against houses, yeah, it's a farmhouse, and next thing it's a palatial mansion. That won't work. So just look at it, is it a farmhouse? And if it is, and there's enough land with it, yes.
Okay, perfect. There's a couple of well, there's one or two policy questions as well that Macra might answer. There's a question here about is there any intention for a retirement scheme for those in their 50s? And there's a few questions about the taxation relief. The answer to most of those questions is nothing has been decided on those. There is the potential, obviously, in the next cap in terms of around succession or some form of early retirement scheme. We know the department in general in Ireland is fairly reluctant to go down that line after the last time, so it may not be possible. And then there was a matter around the reliefs, the review of the reliefs, either at 35 or whether they were due to expire. Those, say for instance, consanguinity relief is currently under review. It will not be changing this year for this coming year. It was in the finance bill as being maintained, but it has been highlighted in that review that there is the potential to reintroduce upper age limits of like, Declan maybe can correct me on this, I think there was talk of 67 or 69 for the transferee.
Yeah, when it was in before, it was 67. But if you read in the thing, they're looking at somewhere between 67 and 70. They didn't commit, as you saw. They commented on, yes, there is an upper age limit proposed for next year, but not commented on. Yeah.
So I suppose that's a political answer. So you know what to do. Send an email to your local representatives and get them to raise it. I know we did a lot of pre-budget lobbying to make sure that it wasn't going to be dropped, because there are some in the Department of Finance who would probably like to see it dropped. But anyway, we'll move on there. For succession farm partnership incentive, the 25k tax credit over 5 years, is this in a government? Sorry, that's actually to the. Is this a government that's due to expire on a certain year, similar to stamp duty relief that was extended in the budget, or is it a long-term option that's due to stay in operation for years to come?
It's in the Finance Acts at the moment, with no end date in it.
No.
So as long as partnerships and succession partnerships are there, it'll stay at the moment. With a health warning, there's a massive review announced for next year of all tax expenditures and tax reliefs. So what we say is here today mightn't be here in 12 months' time.
Exactly, yeah. And I know, again, it'll come down to a little bit of politics there. So if farming as a company is transferred part of the business, or if farming as a company is transferring a part of the business to a child, a tax-efficient way, means of transferring stock or land?
Well, see, the stock or land are in the company, so you're not transferring stock or land, you're transferring shares in the company, which ultimately owns the stock or land. So the answer is yes.
Okay, perfect. We have another one there from someone that was receiving it from a parent. Do they still qualify as a nephew? I think the previous question kind of answered that. You can be. We can't. There's a slightly interesting one. I think this one might be a little bit controversial, but I'm going to bring it up. How would you deal with a disgruntled family member from a taxation perspective? I'm going to assume, how would you deal with a parent from a taxation point of view, and then how would you deal maybe with a contested maybe sibling question, maybe for Sian, and maybe Declan or Austin might say whether they have any experience around that from a taxation point of view.
Yeah. I think, again, it's this conversation, this communication. You've got to sit down and talk about it. And if you find it difficult, you've got to try and get somebody else in, maybe somebody like Austin or Declan, to come and help you talk it through it. So you've got a neutral person there to sort of diffuse the situation. But yeah, you've got to face it. Don't, because it ain't going to go away. If I'm trying to brush it under the carpet, it makes it worse.
Okay, unless Declan or Austin want to comment on that one.
It's a very difficult one, because if it's on debt, it's the estate that is challenged. So it's deemed to come from the parent. But if it's a lifetime, who are the challenging, the parent or the parent being the transferor or the person who has taken it over? So, and it depends whether it's, Sian talked about earlier about someone working on the farm for 20,000 a year when they're due 30,000 a year, would be the thing. So if that's mounted up over 10, 15, 20 years, that could be deemed to be loss of income. So it has to be treated very, very carefully, from it. Because the person might think, oh, great, we're having a punt against a person, but suddenly they end up paying massive income tax on it, and it makes the bitterness even worse. Yeah. So it's really hard. Mm.
I suppose one maybe for Austin there, it's probably one that you come into an awful lot, and it's probably more of an opinion than anything else. Is it more beneficial to retain the maps and entitlements and lease naked lands on a yearly basis, or is it better to sign up long-term lease agreements with maps?
I think you're always better in long-term agreements, like if from both sides, because it gives security. Particularly from the young person or any person farm, you need a long-term agreement because you can plan your farm around that. Like with a year-to-year agreement, no matter how it may look or seem like that, it's only year-to-year. You can't invest in stock. You can't invest in infrastructure. The banks put no rate, where if you have a 10-year or a 15-year lease, the banks will regard that as security. So from purely farming perspective, longer term is always better. You might have to, and it might be beneficial to do something short term just to build up a relationship with it between yourself and a landowner or whatever. But that would, in my view, is otherwise you're always better in the long term.
And I have another one here for you, and then one for Sian. I think after that we might nearly wrap it up. I think we can go maybe 10 minutes over if everyone's happy, because I'd say there's plenty of people waiting on. By the number of questions I have, I won't get to them all. For Austin, I'm a young trained farmer with 10 years dairy farming experience, ranging from, and this individual has either been, I'd say, in New Zealand, because it goes from general milker to ILC or to IC. I'm not familiar with the nomenclature in New Zealand. I have no farm at home. What opportunities are out there for someone like me to farm in my own right? I have no identified partner to join with. All I could bring is my labour and a small amount of equity.
Okay, so the first simple answer is there are opportunities here. And with a small amount of equity, like you will, any of these shared arrangements, you will need to bring some equity, because you need to be able to buy into some stock, because that shows commitment, one, and you have a vested interest in the herd, and that will allow to. But I suppose the challenge is from you. I'm dealing with landowners, and we have people from in Australia, New Zealand, or in England away, and to look at these. It's very hard for Irish landowners to engage with someone who's away. They need to see. It's just the Irish mentality. They do need to see the person face to face and maybe have a get to know each other period. So you do have to sort of bite the bullet and say, come back to Ireland, and it will take 6 months to 12 months to find your opportunity and get in place. Like, it doesn't happen overnight, but there are opportunities. And I suppose the more equity you have, the more opportunities will be there. And if you have enough equity, there is the opportunity to be able to take on something by way of a lease. But without a lot of equity, it's very hard to take on significant leases.
Perfect. I think if they are in Ireland, the first person to ring up is probably yourself and the Land Mobility Service, and see what they can sort. So just a quick question for Sian. I'm going to summarise this as best I can. I'm 30 and working off farm, but very much involved in the business. Parents in the early 60s, substantial amount of debt on farm, but manageable. Parents have had health issues. What is the best way to encourage them to step back?
Well, don't go charging in with your size 10s. I think you've got to be quite subtle about it. I suppose, sitting down and having a conversation about, right, okay, where do you see yourselves in the future? We're concerned about you, maybe even involving other family members as well, if there are other family members, to say, look, we're quite concerned about how you're doing, and putting in and asking what are their worries. In a conversation like that, it's not so much putting your side forward. It's listening to other people. That is the big skill, is actually listening to them. So, you know, starting that conversation and say, look, what are you worried about, you know, and then sort of addressing their concerns first before you sort of say, right, okay, this is what I want. You know, listening to them first is very important. So yeah, approaching that subject and, you know, gently, especially if somebody's ill, you know, and they've had health issues. And, you know, and as I say, addressing their concerns first before you even think about what you want.
Perfect. Okay, I think we might, just the last question there for Declan. If you were in a company setup, should land be bought by the actual company or personally outside the company?
Impossible question to answer without knowing a lot of details, because it depends on borrowings, it depends on the value of the land, it depends on whether the company owes you money by way of a director's loan. It's so wide, it's impossible to answer without knowing the specific thing. A general rule of thumb, if there's a lot of borrowings and a heavy borrowing, company is the best purchaser.
Perfect. Okay, brilliant. Well, look, I just want to thank everybody for staying on. If I can ask, I suppose, one small favor, particularly for the young members in the audience, and we have some of our poll answers actually. We're about, I think over 44% of the audience are young farmers here today. I'm just posting, I suppose there's two links going to be showing up. The first of them is from Macra for our national survey, and then the other one is a jot form just for a little bit of feedback for our Skillnet for doing these in future. We would greatly appreciate if you could take the time to complete both of those for us. I suppose the other one is open to all attendees, and the survey is open to all young people, either in farming or in rural Ireland in general. I'd just like to wrap up by saying a huge thank you to our speakers here today. We haven't gotten to the we have taken all of these questions, and we will do our best, and I know the speakers will do their best to probably try to get feedback in as much as possible. As I say, there are probably some, as Declan has highlighted, which are a little bit more complicated than can be written in an answer, and we'd encourage you to engage with the services that are there. So I'd just like, on behalf of the entire organisation of Macra Firma, and I'd just like to suppose the person behind the scenes who's not getting the credit for all the work, Bridget Quigley, and the Skillnet team who put things together today is absolutely wonderful. So thank you all for taking the time to be here today. Huge thank you to our speakers, and they're all available for follow-up if you engage with their service. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.